Oklahoma with a stellar defensive effort. I said a stellar defensive effort. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Sooners' latest win to move on to 3-2 as they went to Dallas-Fort Worth and took care of TCU 33-14. Got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. Before you do anything, like the video, share the video on social media, and of course, subscribe right here to Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Jason, how you doing this afternoon?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Tracked you down after Oklahoma's third win of the season. And again, it was not a close game. Oklahoma came in as just a 6-point favorite on the road.
Yeah.
And let's talk defense before we talk anything else, because TCU put up a meaningless touchdown late.
Right, yeah.
Other than that, really, Oklahoma jumped out. I know 10-0. I think it was 17-0 before TCU got on the scoreboard. So who do we credit on the defensive side of the ball?
Yeah, I think it was a combined effort. I mean, first you have to give a lot of credit to Alex Grinch for really the turnaround that they've made since the Kansas State game and then the Iowa State game. They were better against Texas a couple of weeks ago. A little inconsistent towards the end of the game, obviously, certainly in the overtime. But yeah, this was their best complete performance on the defensive side of the ball of the year. They tackled a lot better. The defensive line is playing really well right now. Honestly, I think it might be a surprise to some, but I think the defensive line is probably the deepest position group on the team. They're consistently able to get pressure a lot of times with their front four, front three, depending on the package, without bringing a whole lot of blitzing. So, they were able to tackle well in the secondary. They still have some struggles at the safety position. I think probably the biggest concern is Brendan Radley-Hiles, who's seen his playing time diminish a little bit, but he still is playing a lot. He seems to be the most consistent culprit just in terms of penalties in pass coverage and just the inability to make open field tackles. But aside from him, it was a pretty well played game all across the board: coverage, tackling, getting pressure on the quarterback, stopping the running game for TCU as well. So I think a solid performance that I think that they can build on as they keep going through the year.
Jason, I would like to know the last time we had these numbers: 45 rushes, 22 pass attempts, 67 plays for the Sooners, and it was almost 2-1 in that range. It was more than 2-1 run pass ratio. Spencer Rattler, very efficient, 13 of 22 for 332. So making a lot out of those 13 completions with a couple touchdowns. And the best stat of the day, no INTs for Rattler in this one. And TJ Pledger came up with a big day, 122 yards. And obviously Oklahoma has struggled in the running category most of this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see on the offensive side of the ball, every area on the offensive side is really improving a little bit week by week. They're not making huge jumps, but you can tell that they're getting better each time they go out there. You kind of mentioned Rattler from a turnover perspective. They talked a little bit about this on the broadcast. He had five interceptions, 1 fumble, so a total of 6 turnovers, in those 4 games thus far. So, he took care of the ball. Really wasn't even close to a turnover at all in this game. And you see, I think sometimes with younger players, Riley's been a little bit, careful with him this year. Being the first, redshirt freshman that he's had in the program. He benched him in the Texas game. That's hard for a young kid to come back from, but he responded, really well in the second half, played well against Texas, made a lot of crucial plays in the overtime periods. And then certainly today, had a pretty flawless day, obviously in terms of the turnover situation. They're starting to get a lot better play on the offensive line. They came into the season very kind of ballyhoo just in terms of the returning starters that they had and the production, that they had last year, even as new starters into the program. But, they're starting to play a little bit better. Not quite, what you would expect from a typical, Oklahoma offensive line. But you mentioned Pledger ran for 122 yards. They ran for right around 4.5 yards per carry. So you can tell that they are getting better. They're getting a couple of playmakers on the outside. Marvin Mims is is a true freshman, out of Texas, who's playing really well. He had, I don't have the stats in front of me. I think he had 132 yards on 4 catches and a couple of scores. Theo Weiss played pretty well, had about 70, 80 yards receiving on his side. So I think he's kind of finding his go-to guys. And, the one thing that I think Oklahoma fans have been thinking about and looking towards later in the year is they get a few guys back next week. 3 players on the offensive side, 1 player on the defensive side. One big player on the defensive side, Ronnie Perkins, should be back next week from his from the group suspension from prior to the LSU game last year. And then they get Ramondre Stevenson back from a running back perspective, which he's, Riley and the offensive staff have been quick to note that earlier in the year that he was probably going to be the number 1 guy, no matter who was playing. So having him back to kind of solidify that, the running back room will be helpful. Trajan Bridges, who played a little bit from a wide receiver perspective as well, will be back. So getting, maintaining their health and getting some of those guys back should help the continued improvement that we're seeing from the quarterback, and then also the offensive line.
One game situation late in the first half underlines what you're talking about in Lincoln Riley's handling of Rattler and the offense, and especially the way they were playing defense at that point in the game, up 17-7. They were deep in the red zone, had a 3rd and 10. They ran the ball.
Mm-hmm.
They ran the ball. They got about 5 yards. They kicked the field goal, went in 20-7 at half.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that has been talked about here locally a lot is, how successful can you be being a head coach and also an offensive coordinator? All of the everything that you have on your plate in terms of game management and coming up with the game plan each week, calling the plays. How good can you be at a game management situation and be the quarterback coach and be the offensive coordinator? It's a lot that he's put on himself. He's been successful, obviously, through the last few years, but he's got a little bit of heat just in terms of some of the play calls. It seems like a lot of the time he's either ultra conservative or extremely too aggressive. And that kind of came back to bite him a little bit against Texas. If you remember the play late in the fourth quarter. Oklahoma had about a 3rd and 3. There was a couple of minutes left. If they convert, they'll be able to effectively run out the clock at that point. So they didn't convert, they threw the ball. They gave Texas an extra, 25, 30 seconds, and of course they were able to come back and tie that game. So I think there's some questions in terms of his play calling and where he's going with that in terms of being conservative. Where does he need to go? So I think maybe he's kind of learned a little bit, with maybe some of Rattler's strengths, and maybe he can't be quite as aggressive as he would in the past with quarterbacks that have been through the fire and that he trusts a great deal. So yeah, I think you'll probably see that conservative game plan from time to time show. Until Riley feels like he has complete trust in Rattler.
Texas Tech in a close battle with West Virginia as we speak. The Red Raiders are the next opponent for the Sooners on the road in Lubbock, as Oklahoma comes into that game at 3-2. So that would make them 2-2 in the Big 12. And Texas Tech comes in at 1-3, depending on the outcome against West Virginia. So, Jason, realistically, in looking at this team, we're not going to try to surmise what everything else is going to happen throughout the Big 12. Obviously, everyone's rooting against Oklahoma State right now. Well, Iowa State, they both have an undefeated record in the Big 12, so the winner is going to be in a great position. So conference standings aside, just in regards to reasonable improvement for this team and ceiling for the rest of the season, where do you think those areas that have realistic growth and development, where do they lie?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. I think Oklahoma really hasn't found itself in this position in quite some time. They're not completely out of the Big 12 race, to your point, but they need a lot of help. So I think at least to your point, Oklahoma has Texas Tech next week, 7:00 game. It's kind of a Halloween game. Weird things happen typically when they play in Lubbock. A lot of high scoring games typically happen. Then they have Kansas, and then they host Kansas, and then they host Oklahoma State. So I think you continuously improve, these next two games against, certainly Kansas, obviously in the bottom of the Big 12. Texas Tech is near that. You still improve on the offense and defensive side, certainly the tackling on the defensive side, shoring up that secondary, particularly at the safety position, continuing to work that running game, let your offensive line improve more, rely on that, and then, really just put Rattler in situations where he can be successful. To your point of throwing 22 times, and I believe they ran 46 times or 45 times, if that was right today. But really being able to rely on that running game and just, allow Rattler to be successful. And, you go into that Oklahoma State game in a few weeks, you're 5-2 at that point, hopefully, kind of looking at that schedule from that mindset and, see what happens. They've got the back end of their schedule is not as difficult as the front end. They certainly have Oklahoma State. They travel to West Virginia, host Baylor. So, there's an opportunity. Obviously, they need a lot of things to go their way to kind of make their way back into that Big 12 championship game. So, I think certainly Oklahoma fans don't have a hard time rooting against Oklahoma State, but I think really you really want, if you're Oklahoma and you want to get back into the Big 12 race, you probably would want Iowa State to win that game today, right? Because you have Iowa State and Kansas State that are undefeated in conference. Effectively, they have a 3-game lead on Oklahoma with a tiebreaker. So even though Oklahoma State hasn't lost, Oklahoma has yet to play Oklahoma State. So if they were to win that game, they would have the head-to-head tiebreaker over them. But yeah, it's a lot to be played. I think, from a perspective, from an Oklahoma perspective, as long as they can improve and get better, which they have done since that Iowa State game, even since the Kansas State game, they were better against Iowa State. They just weren't able to finish that. So if they can continue to do that, I think it'll put them in a good position to, at least have a battle, put themselves in that opportunity to get back into the race.
Please like the video, share the videos out on social media, subscribe right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Hit that bell for the notifications to know when we go live. Jason Ray, Last Word on College Football. Please check out his work and the rest of the there at Last Word on College Football, breaking down the game we love. Oklahoma, of course, a dominant win impressively over TCU on the road, 33-14. Jason, we appreciate you stopping by.
All right, Mark, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.